Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is refusing to accept a new ceasefire proposal as the war in Gaza grinds on and famine claims additional lives. Hamas says that it agreed to a partial deal and signaled it would accept a broader one, but Netanyahu dismissed both. Netanyahu is accusing the militant terror group of trying to survive, while Israel continues to push for a full-scale offensive on Gaza City to eradicate the militant fighters. This comes after 4 Palestinians were shot dead by Israeli forces while trying to reach a food distribution point south of the city. Joining us now to unpack this further is our contributor, David Clement. Now, David, can you walk us through what likely Israel objections to a ceasefire plan are?
Yeah, so what was originally proposed here that Hamas allegedly agreed to would have been a 60-day pause in fighting, and in return, would have been half of the remaining hostages. It's estimated that there are about 50 hostages, 20 of whom are alive. And so this morning, in the press briefing that the spokesperson for Netanyahu does, essentially it was echoed that they're not going to accept any deal that's a partial return of the hostages. And so that, for them, was a non-starter because there are estimated to be 20 alive. And if there's no guarantee that those living hostages are the ones who are going to be returned, this isn't a particularly interesting deal from the Israeli perspective. And so the first objection is the hostages. Putting it bluntly, they want all of them in one go if they're going to agree to any type of ceasefire. This second major aspect is what happens with Hamas, because the other war aim for Israel has been to, whatever Gaza looks like after the war, it can't be the same scenario as it was on October 7th. And so their position from the beginning has always been the dismantlement of Hamas, whether that be them defeating them entirely militarily, Hamas laying down its weapons and surrendering, or even the proposal, which is Israel has supported, offering members of Hamas essentially free passage out of Gaza to leave as part of a surrender deal. So the objections really boil down to what was proposed don't go far enough from the Israeli perspective for either of their goals here, both the return of the hostages, the living and the dead, as well as creating a scenario where Gaza would not be controlled by Hamas in the future.
And on the issue of the hostages, how likely is it that Israel will be able to get the hostages back that are still in Gaza?
So this is where things get really difficult. And they get difficult because there are essentially two ways to go about returning the hostages. The first is to try and rescue them. And despite their best efforts, the Israelis, I believe, have only rescued less than 10 hostages in total, meaning where they've gone into a combat scenario and actually freed the hostages from Hamas. And that's mostly because of the tunnel infrastructure under Gaza, the way in which Hamas can essentially move underground, move hostages underground, and stay hidden. It's important to remind viewers that when we're talking about how elaborate these tunnel systems are, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip. And so it really is a cat and mouse game in terms of trying to find and free hostages. In terms of getting them back, that's really where we are right now in terms of getting them back via some sort of negotiation for a ceasefire. But from the Israeli perspective, it has to also ensure that they're going to get all of them back. And there has to be some clear pathway to ensuring that Hamas isn't still in power after the war. Because again, from the Israeli perspective, if let's say they were to agree to end the war completely and have some of the hostages and not all of them returned, that would essentially be creating an incentive for terror organizations to take hostages to leverage Israel into making decisions that it maybe otherwise wouldn't, and putting Israel in a compromised position. And what makes this even more complicated is that there is a Israeli kind of mantra or philosophy that they don't leave anybody behind. And Hamas knows that. And so they know that the longer that they can hold on to hostages, living or dead, the more that they can use that as leverage on the Israelis to get concessions in terms of trying to figure out, from Hamas's perspective, trying to figure out a way in which they can possibly end the war while still maintaining power in the Gaza Strip.
And in the terms of dismantling Hamas, is that goal feasible right now if the war continues?
So it is feasible, and they are certainly doing it in terms of the number of Hamas terrorists who have been killed. The problem is really right now the global perception on that. You have uh, multiple kind of trigger points that are causing global pushback against the Israeli war, Israel's war against Hamas. The first is obviously the food situation, which, according to, again, the spokesperson for Netanyahu this morning, has significantly improved over the last week or so. Their evidence for that was citing the prices in which are being charged for basic food items in Gaza has gone down dramatically. That would suggest that there's been a rapid increase in the supply of food if things are getting cheaper, because they're not making this food for themselves at this point. It's an active war zone, and so it's it's the food situation, but then also you see footage of bombings. There was a bombing at a hospital. They've now provided some clarification in terms of why they bombed that hospital. Some of it has to do with the possibility of a Hamas cameraman essentially reporting troop positions from the top of that hospital. But it's incredibly hard to win the PR war, and push back against this mounting global pressure to come to a ceasefire, when there are these videos online that show a hospital getting bombed. And as is the age of social media, that makes its way around the world 20, 30, 40 million times before we really get any clarity on whom the target was. And then we find out today that one of the people actually killed in that hospital bombing, as tragic as it was for the innocent people who were killed, was one of the terrorists who actually entered Israel on October 7th. And so it is a uphill climb, in terms of dismantling Hamas, because in order to do it, you need to have a more enhanced, prolonged war effort. But in order to do that, you also have to combat the perception of famine in Gaza, as well as the global kind of pushback on civilian casualties.
And how much is international pressure and the growing food crisis playing into the push for a ceasefire?
It's pretty significant. It's pretty significant. I mean, we've seen Canadian officials, British, French, etc., um, put out statements saying that they're calling for a ceasefire because the food situation is at a fairly dire point. I think where Israel may be struggling or losing some of the PR battle is establishing whose fault that is. Their argument would be it is Hamas's fault. They've ensured that more than enough calories per day for every citizen has entered the Gaza Strip. It's a question of how it's distributed when it's there, whether or not the existing aid distribution networks that operated previously, like UNRWA or the UN, were actually functional or compromised by Hamas. And so the pressure there is significant, but it's only really going to be significant if there are consequences. And consequences would include things like sanctioning Israeli officials or potential arms embargoes, which we know some European countries have started. But at the end of the day, if the Americans aren't doing an arms embargo, then Israel, with even though they are getting bad press, can continue to pursue the war effort against Hamas, while ensuring that they have the weapons that they need.
And how does Palestinian statehood play into the ceasefire negotiation process?
This is a really interesting one because it leaves a lot of people scratching their heads, because even the prime minister has said that Canada wants to recognize a Palestinian state, but one that is without Hamas. And so, if you have a ceasefire that keeps Hamas in power, how do you go about recognizing a Palestinian state with one of the conditions being that it's not Hamas who gets to partake in 2026 elections. So we have differing viewpoints and policies that conflict with each other. It's almost as if both announcements are kind of made in a vacuum, and the different parties aren't talking to each other in terms of how two pieces of foreign policy can coincide. It was interesting this morning, though, that the German chancellor, when meeting with Prime Minister Carney, said that Germany would not be proceeding in recognizing a Palestinian state. And I think that is probably the more realistic and mature response, because ultimately, I think from the German perspective, they realize that we can't have a conversation about statehood until Hamas is defeated, and Israel has to defeat Hamas in order for any progress to be made on that front.
Well, David, thank you so much for the time today.
Not a problem.
Stay with us. We'll have more news right after the break.